Schofield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Smithy and I have been here, this is our 20th term, and like most people here, everybody here, we have not, I don't know, Mr. Craddock or Chair Thompson may have been through this before, but this is the first time we've ever done this. And we're asked to do something that just doesn't happen very often, but we're asked to do it almost in the dead of night. One of the things I do when I practice law is that I realize that what the prosecutor does first in any kind of proceeding is they always make the jury kind of mad at my client so that whenever they're rendering a verdict, it's going to be more about, sometimes about being mad at the person than what the person actually did or didn't do, for that matter. Today, you're going to be asked to vote on the board, and you got three choices. You got present, not voting. You got yea and aye and no. That's generally what we use for voting on bills, where we decide that, well, if you like a bill, you vote aye. If you don't like a bill, you vote nay, and sometimes you vote present, not voting. And admittedly, sometimes you vote based on who the author is or isn't. And I recognize that, and we all have been guilty of doing that. But today you're asked to vote not just the way you would vote on a bill or against a bill. You're asked to do a little bit, there's an increased standard. And I admit to you that Mr. Murr told me that at some point in his closing, he is going to help you understand what that hurdle is that you have to get over before you make a vote, either aye or nay. Because in a proceeding like this, one of the things you want to do is you want to make sure that you're not voting based on whether you're mad at the person. Now, I don't want this to be partisan either. The election was held back in November, and so it was decided. I suspect that most of the Democrats in here didn't vote for General Paxton, like I didn't. I suspect that most of the Republicans in here did vote. But that's not what this vote is about today. It's not having the election all over again. This is whether or not you believe that General Paxton ought to be transferred over to the Senate. His policies and practices ought to be transferred to the Senate to make a determination as to whether or not he ought to be impeached. That ought to be a pretty high standard for us. That ought to be a pretty high standard. And it ought to be a standard that's higher than politics, higher than our politics. Because if we just base it on politics, all the Democrats would vote aye and all the Republicans would vote no. But I suspect that that's not the way it's going to happen here. For me, I am speaking on this bill because I intend to vote a white light. And I intend to vote a white light not because I don't believe General Paxton is guilty, not because I don't believe he's innocent, but I do believe that the process, as you've heard from my good friend Chairman Smithy on down, that the process ought to be such that we are convinced that going forward is the best thing for this House to do, is the best thing for this House to do. And we ought to do it absent any emotions or emotional feelings about General Paxton. That's not what this is about. If it was about that, I would go to my seat and it was just based on emotions, I'd vote to kick General Paxton out today. He wouldn't have to go to the Senate. He can just do it from the House and let him be gone. But I don't think that's what we ought to do, members. I think we ought to pay attention to this very closely. Because what we're doing is not only to General Paxton, but it's doing it to the citizens in the state of Texas. Because they voted for General Paxton. I didn't, like I told you, but the citizens of Texas voted for General Paxton. And I think that we ought to honor that at least to the extent that we are convinced that General Paxton abused his office to the point that we ought to be able to go to the Senate side and vote for impeachment of General Paxton. Now, I will tell you that this is not a difficult decision for me, because I never get to the point of whether General Paxton is innocent or guilty. I don't do that. I do this because the process by which we're getting this done seems to be abbreviated to the point that it just encroaches on due process. And I believe everybody ought to respect the due process rights of everybody here, everybody in their district, and every Texan ought to be afforded their due process rights. There was a time in my history and the history of black people in this country and in this state that we didn't get due process. Sometimes they found us guilty and then they had the trial. And I don't think that's what we ought to do today. I don't think that's what we ought to do. I don't think we ought to decide to find General Paxton violated anything without the due process rights being protected. And so, Mr. Speaker and members, I would ask you to at least pay attention to your vote. This is not, like I said, voting on a bill.
Mr. Kane, for what purpose?
Does the gentleman yield for a question?
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
Well, yes, I'll yield for my good friend,
The gentleman yields.
for Maverick's dad.
You're discussing the determination of guilt or innocence. Do you believe that's something that this body's supposed to determine as the House?
Not really, not really. We're not supposed to be determining guilt or innocence. We're supposed to be determining whether there is probable cause to believe that General Paxton is the person who committed whatever it is they're saying he committed. That's what we're supposed to be doing.
Okay. You're discussing, wanting to hear more evidence and things. Do you believe that's also something the House does, or is that the responsibility of the Senate?
Well, I think there ought to be a standard here, Chairman Kane. There ought to be a standard here, and then there's an even higher standard when it gets to the Senate. Because I believe that in order for us, you've heard the expression that it's in Texas you can indict a ham sandwich. And that's because, you're right, the limited evidence that a person has to have, that the prosecutor has to have, in order to perfect or get an indictment, which is why sometimes we end up challenging the indictment. And sometimes we win at that because the indictment is so full of holes, and that's what I think this is.